Outburst, a Todd Mills Mystery, Book 4. Author, R.D. Zimmerman. Publisher, Scribble Pub, Minneapolis, Minnesota, 1998. Narrator, Eric Ost. Chapter 31. Clenching her eyes shut, Chris knew she shouldn't have come back to Minnesota. Everything she hated about herself was here. No, after what had happened in California, she should have kept going, escaped to a place where no one would ever have found her. Hawaii, Thailand, Kathmandu, New Delhi, someplace far, far away. Instead, she'd returned, if not to Duluth, then to her home state, and now she'd been caught. How could she have been so absolutely stupid? And this was it. All her life she hadn't felt simply shunned and rejected, but pursued and hunted. In California, she'd escaped, but now they had her once again, and perhaps this time they'd really do it. Succeed in destroying her. She opened her eyes, horrified that she was here in this small cell on the 5th floor of City Hall. A tiny hole, not much more than 6 by 8. The walls and even the ceiling covered with steel. On one side hung a steel platform covered with the skimpy mattress on which she now sat. On the other stood a stainless steel sink and toilet, the two of them combined into a stumpy little tower. The sink on top, the lidless toilet protruding from the bottom. The only window, a small glass one in the door, was covered from the outside with a piece of paper on which was written, "The truth will set you free." In the upper corner of the cell was a video camera mounted behind a shield of glass, and she looked up at it and screamed at the top of her lungs, "Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you!" This was a cruel place, this Minnesota. Never had Chris been anywhere so ruled by climate. Never had she heard of a city or a state where a person's mood was defined by temperature, humidity, dew point, wind chill, and by light, sunlight, from the wonderfully long summer days when the glory seemed to never fade, to the short, cruel days of winter when getting out of bed was like crawling out of a black cave into a black cave. In equally severe but southern climes like Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, they'd conquer their cruelty with air conditioning, so much so that people complained not about the severity but the monotony. But not here. Not in Minnesota. In these northern plains, the winds came up, the storms blew in, things heated up, they chilled down, they blew away, they froze, and thus people's lives were defined just as hers had been. Bringing her knees up to her chest as she sat on the bunk, she clutched her arms around her legs, bowed her head forward, and closed her eyes. Recalling happier times, Chris was taken back to the summers of her youth, when the blue sea of Lake Superior would stretch and stretch forever, until it somehow melded with the heavens and did a Mobius flip of sorts, looping back over Duluth in endless daylight. Those summers seemed to never want to end. But of course, they always did, and all too soon as well. The sun dropping from a beacon of strength to a weak orb that skimmed just above the horizon. Chris reached around and down to her crotch, filling her empty sack. If she'd had the voice of a bird, and if these were Venetian times, she might have enjoyed life as a castrato. As it was, the world today saw her not as a gift, but a monster. It had been so cold, tumbling back through time. She started crying. "This kilt's kind of cool," Chris had thought, picking it up in the laundry room. "I wonder what it would feel like." What a fool. What a complete idiot. If she could only do it over, that one moment, that one act. It had changed so much. Everything, really. Her brothers had come down, spied their brother Christopher in a skirt, and started screaming and shouting the worst of all possible curses. Homo! And little Chris had torn away the skirt, pulled on the gym shorts, and run out, dashing through the frigid night to his grandparents'. Then, of course, he'd fallen. What a sissy. Couldn't even make a dash through the winter night without tumbling, as if she were watching a video that she could play over and over again. Chris had conjured it up countless times. How Chris had torn through the sub-zero night, his stocking feet running over that dry, packed snow, the cold biting at his lungs and turning his tears into icicles. God, they know! Now what? He'd been running so quickly that he hadn't seen it. The patch of ice lingering beneath the snow, a film of ice so thin as to be invisible. His feet had hit it, shot right out, and swung away above his head. There was no way Chris had been able to catch himself, and he'd fallen back and smacked his head so hard that everything had gone black. I've got to get up, Chris remembered thinking. It's 30 below. But of course, Chris hadn't been able to move and had slipped away. If a neighbor hadn't spotted him lying on the sidewalk nearly 30 minutes later, he would have died. How many times had he wished that he had? Fuck, thought Chris, sitting in her cell. Only in Minnesota could you freeze your balls off. Quite literally so. That night, they'd rushed Chris to the very hospital where his mother was working, treated him for hypothermia, and amputated not only the frostbitten tips of 3 fingers and 2 toes, but his testicles, which had flopped, exposed from his gym shorts. And thus, his fate was cast. Which was why, a few years ago, he'd moved to California, where he met Joan Rain. First, his transgender mentor, and later his lawyer. Started on hormones and tried his best to become Chris with a K. It might have worked too. No, it had been working. She was on her way to being happy. Yes, Chris was going to be whole, loving and loved, not the tragic outcast. And for a few fleeting minutes, when Dave had taken her into his embrace and pledged himself to her, Chris had seen it too. Happiness, pure and unbridled. For the briefest of moments, she sensed that the hard times were over, and that Dave was hers, and she was his. An honest man, a string of pearls. That was all she wanted out of life, but it had been so fleeting, so brief. The love she felt for him, and he for her, and the future she clearly saw for them. Both because then Dave's groping hand had discovered her truth, her erect penis. And in a single second, he'd gone crazy. His eyes crazed with horror. He had stared at Chris. "You fucking freak!" he had screamed, leaping away from her. He'd then brought back one of those massively guy arms and punched her in the jaw. Chris had gone tumbling from the couch, screaming and falling to the floor in the tiny living room. She looked up, seeing the vile hate in his eyes. "No," she had begged. "Please, I love you." When he started toward her, when Chris was sure that he meant her only the worst harm, she scrambled backward toward the kitchen, grabbing one of the chairs, pulling herself up, and as he charged toward her, she had no choice but to lunge for his gun, which lay so innocently in Dave's gun belt on the kitchen counter. "Stop!" Chris had screamed through her tears. "Stop, or I'm going to blow your fucking head off." What a disaster. What an explosion. She could see it. She'd always see it. How his head exploded, bursting with shattered bone and juicy cartilage. The fountain of blood. Could it have been more horrific? Slumped in her cell, she was lost all over again in the terror of that night, and how everything had gone so wrong when she heard the deep buzz of electromagnets. The next second, her door swung in, and a detention deputy, an older man with no hair and a large waist, stood there. "Someone here to see you," he pronounced. She wiped her eyes, then uncurled her legs and swung them to the floor. She fussed a bit with her hair, blotted her lips, but there wasn't much to be done. She hadn't slept more than an hour or two last night. Some nut down the hall had screamed half the night, and besides, there was no mirror. Plus, she was wearing the same clothes she'd been arrested in last night. "Oh, Christ, girl, you're not making a good fashion statement." "No, not at all." "This way," grumbled the guard. As soon as Chris neared the door, the deputy took her by the left arm, his thick old fingers sinking into her soft skin. He let the cell swing shut, and then stirred her down the corridor, past cell door after cell door. Glancing once to her right, Chris saw a face filling the small window of one of the cell doors. The nose and mouth smashed against the glass, the eyes stretched wide in jealous curse. Moving on through a maze of hallways and gates, all that Chris was aware of was the buzzing of locks, the clanging of doors. "Right here," he said, pushing Chris into her room. Stumbling into a small, windowless chamber with a low ceiling, Chris focused on a woman standing there, tall and thin, a narrow face with short brown hair. It's attractive, too. And it ran through Chris's mind. Tea? No. She sensed it as quickly as she thought it. The shoulders are too narrow, the hips too big, the feet too small. This one's a dyke. But who? The door behind them shut, and only then did Chris notice the small table with 2 chairs, one on each side. "Good morning, Chris. My name's Janice Gray, and I'm..." "Let me guess," interrupted Chris. "You're my new attorney." Bristling, the woman looked her up and down, then, after a long moment, finally said, "That depends." "You know my attorney, Joan Ryan, don't you? She sent you, didn't she?" "No." Her brow knit. Chris asked, "Then why the hell are you here?" "Let's just say I'm a transgender ally." "Oh, for quaint Super Dyke, to the rescue. I'm saved," quipped Chris. "Heavens, you are a dyke, aren't you?" "Fuck off." "Yep, you are," she said with a nervous laugh. "So tell me, how are you going to get me out of here?" "No," said Janice, shaking her head and crossing her arms. "That's not how I work. First of all, you're the one in this shitload of trouble. Second, I haven't decided whether or not to take you on." "Well, in that case, doll, I'm not sure if I want you either." Chris studied her, wondered if Janice could get her off as Joan had. "In fact, before I even let you think of representing me, I want you to take a good look at me. God knows I look like shit, but check me out from head to toe. Just do it. That's right. That's good. Now, look straight into these eyes of mine and tell me one thing. Do you see a sicko psycho killer?" A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.